Guild Wars, Sea of Sorrows. Chapter 10. The thin streets of Port Stalwart twisted in serpentine coils beneath the pale night sky. Moonlight shone brilliantly over the lagoon, the straight line of its gaze far wider and clearer than any roadway in the village. Matcha was all but invisible in the darkness, her tiny figure hiding easily against every wall and behind every rain barrel. Kobaya had to struggle more, darting from shadow to shadow and freezing whenever the city guard passed too close to the back alleys. Sycox, however, had a different problem. Though he could be as silent as a cat, his bulk was a hindrance. Unless there was a building between the burly char and the light of the street torches, it would be fairly obvious he was wandering through the town, especially if he was trying to look inconspicuous. Therefore, he didn't bother to try. Oh, Broadside. Hey, Broadside, the tawny-furred engineer yowled at the top of his lungs. Alone on the main street of the port, Sycox wandered aimlessly, as if he were a drunken sailor on shore leave. He rolled, he staggered, he sung, and he swung a bottle of Black Citadel whiskey in wild curves, lifting it to punctuate particularly ribald lines. I heard the first mate cry. The char's yowling quickly drew the attention of the watchmen, but they were used to such displays. So long as Sycox wasn't causing any trouble or breaking into any of the shops, he could wander to his heart's content. And while the guards kept an eye on Sycox, Kobaya and Matcha crept past them, into the shipyard. You're certain it wouldn't have been better for me to make him look like something that wouldn't attract attention? Matcha grumped. A beached whale, maybe? Save your magic, my friend. We'll be needing it soon enough. Kobaya winked at the mesmer as they crept toward the mooring lines. Kobaya's heart pounded in his chest as they grew ever closer to the clipper ship docked close against the shore. At last, he paused, ankle deep in soft, wet sand. There she is. The Capricorn's tall, slender masts rose over the water, her sleek hull riding so close to the waves that a man could almost reach up and pull himself inside. She was even more beautiful than she'd seemed from the harbor. Kobaya ran his hand along her boards, feeling the smooth, even grain. His hand shook, a tingle creeping up his fingers. The hair on the back of his arm stood up straight, but whether from excitement or some legendary magic, he wasn't sure. Magnificent. Can we sail her alone? For once, Matcha's voice was soft. 3 of us? No, but we won't have to. We can rig and set her lower sails to catch the breeze, and then drift with the last of the outgoing tide. The Pride is stationed at the mouth of the lagoon, ready to cast lines and tow the clipper out to sea. Once the Capricorn is free, Kobaya murmured eagerly, she's ours. Yup, Matcha teased. And as soon as Old Bade shows up and hands over his pointy crown, I'll be Queen of Criada. Kobaya ignored the jibe. He waded into the water, reaching out to grip one of the mooring lines that held the Capricorn still. With a few quick saws of his broad-bladed knife, Kobaya cut through the hemp. Matcha shimmied up one of the others, slipping aboard the Capricorn with an easy vault. She's perfect. Kobaya ran his hand over her smooth black hull. Not a mark, not a splinter out of place. It was now or never, and Kobaya had always hated the word never. Sycox's singing echoed with gusto across the harbor. Oh, Broadside, Broadside, I-I-D. Haul 'em high and let 'em dry. I think that gear-brain char pretends a little too well. The Asura wrinkled her nose. At this point, I'm not entirely sure he's pretending. Kobaya frowned. Sycox better hurry and lose whoever's following him, or we'll miss the tide. Don't worry. Any minute now, Watch Commander Pirandra will rally a pile of guards and toss him tail first into the puddle. She's tough as an Etten, that one. Never gives anyone a second chance. If she gets hold of us, we're as good as dead. Don't tempt fate. Kobaya made the sign of duena in the air. Fate can't be tempted. It's part of the eternal alchemy, just like everything else. Days pass, the cogs turn, the future comes. Matcha chuckled at his superstition. Don't worry. Everything's in place. Sycox will sneak back, and will cut the last of the stays and use the mooring poles to push off from the sand. After that, the breeze and the tide will sweep us out to meet the pride. I'll even use an illusion to darken the Capricorn. She'll be nearly invisible against the water at night. Once Sycox gets here, that is. Catch 'em at sea, set them alight, burn 'em all the day and night. We'll give 'em a broad CIIID. If Sycox gets here, that is. He'll be here. Matcha pushed a sandbag over the side, letting it sink into the water with a soft flump of the waves. That fur brain didn't like this idea. Kobaya fretted. Maybe he's changed his mind. He hasn't. Sycox never abandoned you, Matcha said. When Kobaya raised an eyebrow inquisitively, the Azura pinned him with a glare, the way one might fix a bug to a piece of corkboard. Sycox considers you part of his warband. A warm feeling swelled in Kobaya's chest at the Asura's words. Part of a warband? That was like being a member of a Char's family. With a wide grin, he slashed all but the last few tethers and pulled himself aboard the dark shadow of the ship. Kobaya wrung the water from his clothing onto the smooth boards of the deck, shivering in the chilly night. Wriggling up the central mast, Kobaya began to untie the sail lacings. The bowlines spun out in his hand, dropping stealthily to the ground as the canvas began to unfurl. It wouldn't take much to start the ship moving once the sails could catch the soft night breeze. Already, he could feel the Capricorn tugging gently against her last moorings, amid the sound of the ship moving. Did you hear that? His hands froze on the mast lines. That sounded like music. Matcha pushed another sandbag over the side. Sycox bellows like a foghorn. I'd hardly call it music. No, not that. Listen. Wind rippled the Capricorn's sails. In the quiet, Kobaya could hear water lapping against the hull, echoing as it rolled onto the sandy shore. Laughter trickled across the water from port stalwarts' bars and inns. Lights drifting over the water as late-night patrons and sailors moved about on the dock. The sound of violins and drums pulsed in some distant tavern. And farther along the city streets, Kobaya could hear faint shouts, as if from some mild argument or fight. None of that had caught his attention. There was something beneath the noise of Port Stalwart and the sea. He could hear a soft chiming, like a string of silver bells twisting about a slender ankle. There it is again. Did you hear it? You don't have to repeat yourself, Colby. Asura have far better hearing than humans. You know. Matcha's oversized ears rose slightly. You're right. I do hear something. But who would be playing an Asuran Exaphone in Kriata? What? Before she could answer, something splashed against the side of the ship. Kobaya spun, fingers leaping to the hilt of his sword. To his relief, the hand that clambered over the gunwale was covered in orangey fur, the claws neatly trimmed and shortened. In a moment, Sycox's bushy head poked up between the railings. Help, he whimpered, water dripping in rivulets down his shoulders. Had to swim from the docks. Sycox shuddered. I almost drowned. Matcha and Kobaya grabbed the big Char's arms and pulled him aboard. Did the watch see you? Matcha whispered. Do they know we're here? Nope. The watch commander and her guard were up on Docker's Row, handling some kind of disturbance there. It looked like someone set fire to a row of black powder bangers inside a rain barrel. The whole pub was in an uproar. Sycox pulled himself into a crouch on the deck. Instinctively and without warning, the Char shuddered, twisting from side to side in animalistic joy, before Kobaya and Matcha could react. You crazy. Short-sighted, half-witted, Matcha spluttered. She and Kobaya stood in shock on either side of Sycox, drenched from head to toe in the cast-off water from the sodden char. "It's not my fault," the burly char whispered sheepishly. "I can't help it. When a char gets wet, we have to shake it off. It's an involuntary reflex, like human sneezing." "I'll involuntary you, you ridiculous hairball." While they laughed, a shadow swept up behind Kobaya, taking advantage of their distraction. A hand grabbed his neck as a warm body pressed against him from behind. In an instant, a bright blade flashed to his throat. A voice cut through their amusement with icy command. "Freeze, all of you. One move, and I swear by Balthazar's twin hounds, I'll leave you dead." They had been surrounded, albeit by a small group. A second black-garbed figure stood warily behind Matcha, the point of a short spear blade crowded against her ribs. A third readied himself a few feet away, pistol aloft, pointed at Sycox's furry head. "I thought you said you ditched the watch," Matcha protested fiercely. "I did. I swear I did." Quick as lightning, the char shifted out of his crouch and launched onto Matcha's opponent. Their attackers thought the threat of a fight would deter them. They'd clearly never fought char. The gunman missed his shot by a mile. Kobaya saw his opponent's hand loosen a fraction of an inch on the hilt of the dagger. Seizing the opportunity, Kobaya drove his elbow into the ribs behind him with all of his might, and felt the body behind him buckle. As the knife blade fell away from his throat, Kobaya spun eagerly and drove his fist into the belly of his foe. He turned to crack his fist against his foe's skull. It was a woman. Kobaya froze. He'd punched women before. There were as many female pirates as there were males, and plenty of the roughest sailors in his crew were women. But this one was glorious. Almost as tall as he, and willowy. Her hair was a dark mahogany and pulled into a thick ponytail that poured over her shoulder like a banner. She wore leather pants, a gray blouse, and a vest that buckled tightly beneath her breasts. Dark boots, soft and flexible, gripped the deck of the Capricorn with a sailor's easy grace. Her face was strong-featured, with wide lips and a long, aquiline nose, and her full lips were curled into a snarl of pain and fury. Nevertheless, she was definitely not a member of the Watch. "I'm sore," Kobaya started to say, reaching instinctively to help her up. She repaid his kindness with an uppercut that sent Kobaya spinning. On the far side of the ship, the man with the spear tried to impale Matcha, but she caught his weapon in a fold of her thick blue robe. Eyes flashing with anger, the Asura turned and whispered a few words of magic through gritted teeth. Purple sparks erupted across his face and eyes. Before he could regain his sight, Sycox was upon him, and the man found himself flung over the side of the vessel and into the sea. "Aye, are you all right?" Dropping his pistol, the gunman drew 2 long blades from his belt and strode toward them. He was a rough-looking sort, with greasy black hair and old scars crisscrossing his forearms and shoulders. "Claw scars." "I'm fine, Henst," the woman declared. "Throw them overboard and cut the last of the stays. These goons were trying to do our work for us, but we'll finish the job." You're not watchmen," Kobaya stammered. "You're trying to steal the Capricorn. What we're doing is none of your business." Henst's eyes moved to Sycox with a twisted delight as he readied his swords. "How exciting. Char. Hey, mongrel. My grandfather was a member of the Ascalonian nobility. He taught me how to deal with flea-bitten strays like you." The woman Isai made a quick gesture toward the shadows of the ship's quarterdeck, and more figures stepped out of them, all tough-looking sailors carrying knives, bosun's pins, and other short weapons. Kobaya counted 7 in all, including the one swimming for his life in the tide. The man with 2 swords faced off against Sycox, but with a flick of his tail, the char leapt up to the spar over the deck, cutting the stays with his claws. Unbound, the sail fell from the yardarm and poured down over the black-haired man in a massive tangle of canvas. "Anyone who says they know how to fight Char," Sikok said scathingly, "doesn't deserve the chance to prove it." Kobaya and the woman spun in circles, striking back and forth to test each other's resolve. "Just the three of you?" The woman laughed. She flicked back her dark ponytail and tossed the dagger back and forth between her hands. "By the king's shaggy red beard, how were you expecting to get the ship away? The same way you were. We're going to use the tide." Kobaya grabbed a yardarm and swung on it, kicking as hard as he could. The bottom of his boots collided with the woman's shoulders, knocking her back, but only half a step, and she was swinging her dagger at him even before Kobaya landed on the deck once more. By Grenth, was this woman a stone golem? Fool, we bet on more than the tide. Isaiah's blade swished close to Kobaya's chest, rending his shirt, and leaving a shallow, bloody slash on his skin. Kobaya ducked her second stroke and leapt back from the third, trying to lead her away from the others. Unfortunately, it seemed she was ready for that ploy. Nearby, Sikox and Matcha were holding their own against the other sailors. But even with the Char's ferocity and the Asura's magic, they would soon be overcome by the numbers. "Vera," she raised her voice and issued a command. "Take care of these trespassers." "As you please, my lady," said an unexpected voice close by. Kobaya glanced around, trying to figure out who had spoken. An elementalist stood on the surface of the water at the ship's side, staff in hand, his eyes alight with glee. The man was thin to the point of fragility, tall, with long fingers that resembled a bird's talons, and wore a pair of wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. Red, streaked brown hair hung in thin strands around his head and shoulders, half covering the man's narrow face. He did not wear a bright robe, but instead wrapped himself from head to toe in strange, bandage-like strips of black and green fabric, each strip embroidered with magical sigils of power. As Kobaya watched, the elementalist lifted his hands and whispered, and a strong breeze swept through the chaos, filling the half-furled sails. In its wake, the ship's mast made a soft creak of protest, and once again, Kobaya thought he heard the sound of silver bells. Suddenly, a brilliant flash of light exploded nearby, and Kobaya smelled the acrid scent of burning ozone. Before he could move, a white-hot bolt of chain lightning ripped from the elementalist's hand and seared the air, arcing into the main group of combatants. It crashed through them indiscriminately, burning flesh and fur alike. As it crackled and faded, 2 of the humans had fallen unconscious, and a third staggered in shock. Sikox withstood the blow better than the rest, merely sagging to his knees with a dazed, pained expression. "Vera," Isaiah admonished. "Those are our sailors." "Theirs, too," the elementalist said breezily. He gave her a lopsided, lunatic grin and walked across the water toward the Capricorn. "Magic isn't always predictable, Captain." The man's voice was a soft, breathy whisper. "We must accept the thunder along with the rain." "Brilliant." Isai shook her head in resignation. Before she could say more, a piercing whistle split the air. On the beach, men and women dressed in the blue tabards of Port Stalwart's Guard raced down the narrow streets. Among them was a stocky older woman with honey-colored hair tucked beneath a blue-studded chaplet. Kobaya saw her lift the whistle to her lips again for another ear-splitting note, summoning the rest of the militia to her side. "Watch Commander Pirandra." Kobaya blanched. "She'll have us dancing on the gallows if she catches us." "That's a problem," Isai agreed, narrowing her eyes. "Truce?" Kobaya offered tensely. Mercurial as the sea, Isai quirked her lips in a wry smile. "Done!" She tossed back her dark ponytail and lowered her dagger, impulsively reaching out to shake his hand. Kobaya wondered if she regretted that gesture afterward, He found it difficult to let go. Aisai spun on her heel and jammed her dagger into a belt sheath. "Cut the stays," she called out, no longer caring if her voice carried. "We'll finish this fight later." Set sail toward the open sea. "Aye, Captain." Sailors put away their weapons, scrambling to obey her command. Eager to do his part, Kobaya looked toward his friends. "Sickox, Sickox, get off him." Kobaya rushed to pull Sickox away from a man he'd been choking. The Char, still disoriented from the lightning, tried to focus his eyes on his friend's face. "I'll get off him when stops wriggling," Sickox panted, smacking his dazed captive on the face with one sloppy paw. The blow was enough to knock the man senseless, and he slumped in the Char's grasp. Kobaya shook him roughly. "Sickox, I need you to man the poles. Push the ship off the sand. The guard's coming." "Guard?" Sickox's eyebrows knitted together in a frown. "Commander." "Pirandra, here?" Dropping the unconscious sailor, the tawny Char roared to his feet in terror. Around them, sailors rushed to unfurl the sails, but as they reached for the stays, the sound of bells grew stronger, changing from tinkling amusement to a throatier chime of warning. "Pirandra will be here any minute, you lunk. We have to move." Punctuating his words with shoves, Kobaya half pushed, half guided the Char toward the stern of the ship. "Matcha, hide the Capricorn." "Do it now." Kobaya." The Asura's voice came from the forecastle. "I don't think our plan's going to work. There's a problem." "Matcha, stop arguing with me." The watch commander and her guard raced up the shore, anger radiating from her with every step she took toward them. The soldiers rushed into the water, eager to reach their quarry, even as the Capricorn's sails swelled and snapped the last ropes of her mooring. Desperate to help the ship leave shore, Kobaya snatched up a 10-foot length of pole lying by the ship's railing. He dropped one end into the water, feeling it thump solidly against the sand below the waves. "Sickox, help me push." The Char and the human leaned into their task, shoving the pole hard into the sand. Aisei grasped the pole as well, her hands above Kobaya's, and added her slender weight. The warmth of her body pressed against his made the task seem less arduous, and even in their dire straits, Kobaya couldn't stifle his grin. "I'd advise you to stop doing that, Captain." Matcha's voice was sharp, almost brittle. "What? We've almost—" I said. "Stop." Matcha keened, her voice breaking with panic on the high pitch. Again, Kobaya heard the ringing sound of bells, but they were no longer soft or delicate. Instead, they intensified, erupting into angry peals. "Kobaya?" Matcha yelled, and his eyes were drawn to the front of the ship. Hovering over the Capricorn's forecastle was a wraith-like image whose regal demeanor spoke of ancient days. It was human from the waist up, though blue-skinned and transparent, as if made of wind and smoke. The creature's legs were entirely mist, rising from the ship's prow as smoke and fog cascaded over the water. Remember that story about the Astani D Jinn? Turns out it's kinda true. The mist crept over the Capricorn, rolling like morning fog from the Jinn's ethereal body. It stretched a hand toward Masha with a stern glower. Before the fingers touched her, the Asura scampered back and summoned magic of her own. Chains of light wove from her scepter and struck out toward the Jinn, trying to capture it in their embrace. With a faint, wry smile, the creature shifted in the air. Matcha's chains passed through its transparent form like a net through water. Aisei's mad elementalist, Virad, hissed in menace. Keeping his bright eyes fixed on the Jin, he lifted a clawed hand from his staff and whispered an invocation of air. More lightning crackled about Virad's outstretched fingers, playing hide and seek through the strips of black bandage woven around each of the mage's arms. At his call, whirling gusts of wind swirled through the mist, attempting to force it either to dissipate or to coalesce and be tangled in Matcha's writhing chains. In response, light flowed through the djinn's ethereal form. There was a flash like the sun through clear water. The sea around the Capricorn swelled, rising in great waves against the ship's hull, and with each crashing wave, the boom and toll of chapel bells reverberated through the deck. Kobaya felt them echo deep in his body, shaking his bones with each furious peal. All around him, Isaiah's sailors were knocked into the water as the sound swept the ship's deck clean. As they screamed, the djinn's smile grew. "What is it?" Kobaya howled, grabbing a yardarm rope to keep his balance. The peals continued, so loud he thought he would be deafened. The sail tossed madly above them, torn between Virid's gale and the buffeting swell of the djinn's magic. "Matcha, make it stop." "It's the ship," Matcha shouted, her voice barely carrying through the music and the wind. "The djinn is the Capricorn. The ship's alive and it doesn't want to be stolen." The ringing of the mighty bell rose even farther, and as the sound rippled over the ship, Matcha's chains shattered into thin motes of spinning light. Virid's tornado of wind dissolved as well, delicate wisps of smoke collapsing into nothingness. The djinn gestured with a flick of its hand, and as it did, both magic users were tossed over the side as if they were made of straw. Isay held on to the last. Silhouetted by magic, her grip on the mast slipped, and she was flung into the air by the pulse of the djinn's bells. Without thinking, Kobaya reached to catch her. Their fingers wrapped tightly together, and he clenched his other hand about the yardarm rope. Isay's ponytail snapped in the gale force wind, and Kobaya heard the masts creak and groan with the weight of the Capricorn's ire. Turning to face the djinn, Kobaya ignored the rope biting savagely into his palm. Blood ran down his wrist, and his pale hair lashed at his eyes, nearly blinding him. But Kobaya stubbornly refused to yield. He raised his voice above the din and yelled, "As captain of this vessel, I order you in that instant." The mast line snapped. Kobaya and Isai tumbled end over end into the ocean. The next few moments were a chaotic jumble. Seawater splashed everywhere, churned white by the forces that whipped it into a frenzy. Terror gripped Kobaya. Old memories stirred in him. Another ship, a great wave, and 100 sailors lost beneath the waves. He hadn't realized how clearly he remembered that day until it was echoed, and he was once more flung into the sea by a storm wind. Unable to control his rising panic, Kobaya thrashed wildly, fear choking him as certainly as the ocean could. A gentle hand gripped Kobaya's arm. He tried not to struggle as it dragged him upward. As his head broke the surface, there was another grip, this time on his shoulder. With monumental strength, a massive paw hauled him out of the undertow and dropped him unceremoniously onto the sand. Isay waded out of the water beside him, managing a smile. Kobaya pulled himself to his hands and knees, coughing up water through a raw, salt, rough throat. Forcing open his stinging eyes, he looked out at the lagoon and saw the sleek shadow of the Capricorn sailing without wind or crew back to her harbor in the shipyard. "I couldn't get to you, Cap'n," Sycox lamented. "Lucky thing that girl grabbed hold and pulled you up. She's a real scrapper, isn't she?" Isay lay on the beach beside him, panting in exhaustion. Her sailors were scattered up and down the beach, crawling out of the tide or collapsed on the dunes. Kobaya could hear the two magic users spluttering and arguing somewhere nearby. It seemed that they'd all survived their humiliating withdrawal from the Capricorn. Sycox slumped down onto the sand. The Shar was waterlogged again, his fur sticking out like a half-drowned bilge rat's. All 4 ears hung limply, and a long strand of seaweed was tangled about his horns. The expression on his bestial features was somewhere between exasperation and despair. He looked up at the approaching watchguard. "No use running, I suppose." "None at all," Kobaya agreed. Watch Commander Pirandra marched up to them, sword in hand. From the tip of her jet-black boots to the top of the tabard over her glittering metal armor, Pirandra radiated fury. Her honey-colored hair was damp, and her skin was flushed with anger. Without hesitation, she lowered her sword and pointed the sharp edge into Kobaya's face. "Good morning, Watch Commander Pirandra." Kobaya tried not to move, lest her sword waver and cut off his nose. "You're all under arrest for grand larceny, piracy, and illegal commandeering. Surrender yourself to the guard for immediate execution of justice." She bit off the words angrily, her breath heaving from the effort of the run. 10 more guards moved to surround them, and more were headed toward them from the town. Kobaya held up his hands in surrender, and watched the others do the same. Can't stop, have to." Sikok shuddered. Before anyone could move, he started to shake violently, unable to control his instincts any longer. Water flew off the char in thick splatters, drenching Kobaya, Isai, the watch commander, and most of the others. When the urge finally left him, Sikox let out an aggrieved sigh. Kobaya hadn't thought it was possible for Pirandra to appear less amused, but he'd been wrong. Dripping from head to toe, the watch commander clenched her hand on the hilt of her sword. "That is enough. By the authority given to me as watch commander of Port Stalwart, you are all found guilty of piracy. You will be hanged from the gallows until you are dead."